Hello, my name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and welcome to the Look Forward podcast from S&P Global. In today's rapidly shifting markets, success depends on anticipating what's next. The professionals who excel are those who can spot emerging trends before they fully materialize. The Look Forward podcast delivers exactly that. Insights to help you prepare for tomorrow's opportunities and challenges. We bring you expert perspectives on macroeconomic trends, capital markets, energy transition, and global trade, with a sharp focus on what these developments mean for the decisions that will shape your tomorrow. This podcast connects you with S&P Global's Look Forward Council, bringing cutting-edge research on long-term trends and transformative market shifts. Together, we're committed to providing the forward-looking intelligence you need to navigate uncertainty with confidence. Welcome to this episode of the Look Forward podcast from S&P Global. My name is Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and I will be your host for this episode where we're going to tackle the fascinating subject of decarbonizing aviation. Yes, it's one of the toughest problems facing energy transition. How do you take those carbon emissions away from the aviation sector? And to discuss this subject, I've got two of the most experienced and knowledgeable experts within S&P Global. Roman Kramarchuk, Director, Head of Energy Transition Narratives and Policy at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and Clarita, Associate Director, Biofuels Analytics at S&P Global Commodity Insights, based in Paris. Thank you both for joining us. And before I forget, the authors, co-authors of a really interesting, fascinating report recently published by S&P Global, Decarbonizing Aviation, Scale-Up Costs, Biggest Challenge to Progress, that tackles a lot of these issues. Now, Roman, as I said, this is a big, tough challenge for the world. How do we decarbonize, these big jumbo jets that are taking everyone around the world on their holidays and business flights? How big's the problem? Can you set the scene for us?
Sure thing, Andy, and thank you for having me here. I think also wanted to note that we are co-authors, but there are a number of other authors that also contributed. So this is really a cross S&P Global effort across our different divisions, because aviation really is in some sense, it cuts across a number of different verticals. Why are we talking about this? I think there is clearly a situation where, according to our own data, aviation accounted for around 3% of global energy-related CO2 emissions in 2024, and this share is going to be expanding. We are expecting greater, potentially doubling of global air passenger traffic, and in our scenarios, we actually do a number of scenarios as part of our work. In all but one of our scenario cases, we have overall aviation energy demand greater by 2050, by 2060. Only in one case around that we call Renaissance, which really involves a transition to much more new technologies that we see some of the overall equivalent energy levels dropping off. So this is a current problem in terms of decarbonization. It's an expanding problem because people continue to want to fly. There was some expectations after COVID, after the massive drop of aviation demand during COVID, that the bounce back would be less pronounced, but we are certainly on a path towards much greater aviation emissions going forward, including airport expansions around the world. So challenges are obviously the fact that jet kerosene is is actually a very effective way of transporting, and some of the other alternatives are much more challenged given the needs for low weight, for long distances, etc.
You alluded to this at the end there. That jet kerosene, it's the most efficient way for the transport industry to get people from A to B over long distances. Jet aircraft, the aviation sector. I think it's really interesting what you were saying about the expansion of air passenger transport through to 2050. Where I live here in southern England, we've got two major potential airport expansions which are going through various stages of planning. One at Heathrow, the other one at Gatwick. But the fuel is a really critical part of this. And if you look at sustainable aviation fuel assessed by Platts, it's currently about 3 times more expensive than conventional jet fuel, and feedstock availability is a major bottleneck around that issue of price. So, what are the most realistic pathways for scaling SAF production? That's the production of sustainable aviation fuel, while bringing down these costs, and how might we see some meaningful progress in this area?
As you may know, HEFA is today the only commercially mature and the most cost-effective technology to produce sustainable aviation fuels. But even that, as you said, is 3 times more expensive than jet fuel. And we don't really see a significant cost reduction potential for this pathway in the long term. And as you said, there are limitations related to feedstock availability. So HEFA uses lipid feedstocks, and these feedstocks are in high demand, both from road transport, but also shipping, aviation, and demand is projected to expand going forward. So far, we've had mandates for biofuels in road transport only, but now we are starting to see mandates in shipping and aviation, and also increasing across the world, higher mandates in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, so on and so forth. So that will put a lot of pressure on the HEFA pathway. Now, there are other ways of producing SAF, but these are much more expensive, and they are not as mature as HEFA in terms of technological development. The most promising way technologies so far seem to be alcohol to jet and gasification plus Fischer-Tropsch. We are seeing projects that plan to use these pathways, but so far very few of these projects have reached a final investment decision. And really, the most important bottleneck are high production costs. Alcohol SAF produced via the alcohol to jet pathway and gasification plus Fischer-Tropsch is much more expensive than SAF produced via the HEFA pathway. And although we project significant cost reduction in the long term, they will never be competitive against HEFA. So FT will never be competitive against HEFA. Alcohol to jet can be cheaper, can become cheaper, but only if it's produced from corn ethanol in the US, and only it can be competitive only against SAF produced via HEFA in Europe.
Just as an extension to that, which countries have a competitive advantage in these markets in terms of both production but also the sourcing of the feedstock? I'm guessing, big countries with large populations are producing a lot more used cooking oil and potential lipid feedstocks for this kind of fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the largest producer and source of used cooking oil in the world is Asia, China, and Asian markets. So this is where feedstocks are located, and these countries definitely have a competitive advantage. And actually, what we are seeing is more SAF capacity being built in China, and some of that of the UCO that was previously exported to the United States or Europe is quite likely that it will stay in China to be processed in China and to into SAF.
Now, the report talks about the fragmented policy environment around SAF. What are the most critical policy gaps that you both see around this type of fuel, and what work is being done to create a cohesive international framework for decarbonizing aviation?
I can take a start on that, and certainly there is fragmentation. There is fragmentation, but not just in terms of SAF, but fragmentation in terms of the rationale behind SAF, which is ultimately sustainability and carbon reductions. Part of the issue with policy design around achieving aviation reductions is that it is very expensive right now, that SAF is having some of these challenges around scaling, which we're talking about and will continue to talk about. So the question is, how else can aviation be accountable, or can at least a price be paid that reflects the impact in terms of carbon emissions for this? So I think one of the EU, as in many other instances around environmental regulations, the EU has been a pioneer here. I'll talk about specifically the inclusion of aviation into the cap and trade program of the EU ETS. So technically, the aviation sector, specifically for all air flights within the EU, that emissions from those types of flights are all covered under the EU ETS. So they are currently paying a carbon price that's effective to the same carbon price that's being faced by the power sector or the refining sector or the cement sector in the ETS. They have access to the same instruments, the EUA allowances, and that price is part of their investment and their operational decisions. Now, the EU is unique in that sense. Europe is unique in that sense, and the rest of the world has been pushing back. I can talk about the global approach, which is the one that has been taken on by ICAO, and that's the Corsia program. But I think it's probably worthwhile sticking and talking about some of the regional differences first before we shift back to what may be a more global approach. So I'll pass this on to talk about specifically the SAF differentiation among the different regions.
Yeah, thanks, Roman. So I can talk a bit about the different approaches to SAF policies across the world. Europe is in this respect also at the forefront, right? So it's the first region in the world where we are seeing SAF mandates. First of all, in the European Union through Refuel EU Aviation, but also in the UK. So these are schemes which basically impose SAF incorporation targets for jet fuel suppliers. In the case of the European Union, they start at 2% on a mass basis this year and increase gradually to 70% by 2050. The UK has a similar scheme with targets set out to 2040. The problem is that these schemes are quite different, both in terms of ambition, but also in how they work in practice. So we are seeing differences not only in Europe between the European Union and the UK SAF mandate, but also between Europe and other regions of the world. So in Asia, we are starting to see some Asian countries talking about introducing SAF mandates, but these remain quite modest for now. They're targeting 1% over the next 2 years, 10% by 2030 in the most ambitious case, which is Japan. And in Latin America, so far we've only seen Brazil which will introduce a GHG reduction mandate in 2027 of 1%, and some countries publishing some roadmaps for SAF incorporation, but no firm commitments. The problem with these frameworks is that they are very different, both in terms of how targets are set, right? So some are volumetric, some are in energy content, some are on a mass basis, some place more importance on carbon intensity. Then there are differences in terms of the of feedstock eligibility. Europe is notably very restrictive in this sense. They do not allow food and feed crops. Whereas in other countries, in other regions of the world, you don't have these constraints. Some countries allow certificate trading schemes like the UK, the European Union does not allow that, so on and so forth. So I think that for an airline and for fuel suppliers, it's really difficult to operate in this environment where you have to comply with so many different schemes.
So, and tell me, in the case of Europe, which seems to have some of the most ambitious targets as far as SAF is concerned and decarbonisation of aviation, where's that fuel being made? Is it actually being made in European refineries, or is it being imported in from other regions?
For now, SAF capacity in Europe is not enough to meet demand. So Europe is importing some SAF from other regions, and it will increasingly rely on those imports. So we do have some SAF projects in the pipeline announced in Europe, but those will not be enough to meet this anticipated rise in demand. And you may have heard recently that some some Chinese SAF producers have received a quota to export SAF to Europe next year. That amounts to about 1.2 million metric tons of SAF, which is enough to cover European demand, basically. So yeah, the short answer is that Europe is importing today and will rely on imports going forward, according to our estimates.
Sounds like an energy security risk in some ways. We talk a lot about energy security here in Europe, and that's been put into sharper focus by what's happened with Russia and geopolitics. But it sounds very much, listening to the data, the hard facts that you're both presenting here, that there isn't this capacity in Europe, and any disruption to supply. It's interesting because we all think that energy transition is this magic bullet to sort of wean us off dependency of fossil fuels and those slightly thornier parts of the world that often produce most of those fuels, and actually it just sounds like we're just as dependent for things like SAF.
I think the one thing I would add, Andy, is that you think about the feedstocks that go into SAF and the processes through which you create SAF. I mean, a lot of these are common to processes through which you can also be creating renewable diesel and even marine biofuels. So, I think there is a sort of interconnectedness when you have these sort of renewable, sustainable feedstocks into which sectors may be optimal from both an emissions perspective, but also from a security perspective. So there is potentially more flexibility around this than may initially seem to catch the eye.
But it's fair to say that none of this is going to be cheap, and with 70% of global airlines, I think with credit ratings that are non-investment grade in their category. I think it's a legitimate question. How can airlines realistically finance this transition and the pathway to net zero, especially when they're facing, high capital costs anyway, and pretty thin margins? It's a competitive space, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the nice thing with the report we put out is we had one of the co-authors was from our ratings group, and they brought in that perspective that the highest global airline rating that we had was a BBB plus, and so essentially, as you noted, 70% of the ratings fall into non-investment grade. This is a challenge. This means that any projects would typically have, with lower credit ratings back behind them, will typically have higher costs of capital. So investments would become more costly and thus lower priority versus short-term funding needs. I think this is part of the push for why, on a global scale, the ICAO approach of CORSIA is more flexible in that it allows for an approach that is lower cost and broader in terms of getting those emission reductions from outside the sector, which can certainly be cheaper.
It sounds like we're all going to be paying more for our holidays in the future.
Probably.
Yeah, I know you were going to come in there.
Yeah, I was going to say that this is manageable so far in Europe because the mandates are quite small, 2% of the jet fuel, and also there are the European Union is giving these free ETS allowances, which can help bridge that price gap. But obviously, we will run out of these at some point, and as SAF mandates become increasingly higher, so will costs, right? And we also have to keep in mind that for now, the mandates in the European Union, at least, are for biosaf, which as of now is produced via HEFA, so is less expensive than SAF produced via other pathways. But going forward, we will have eSAF mandates, right? And eSAF is much more expensive than biosaf. And while the cost reduction potential is significant for ESAF in the long term, it will nevertheless remain prohibitively expensive. So that burden on airlines and consumers will just increase with time.
Agreed. I think sorry, Andy. I just wanted to add in terms of the European kind of sensitivity to the costs. They're certainly pushing off more of those costs onto the airlines. So the example of the EU ETS allowances, those are actually getting phased out very relatively soon. So even more of that burden is going to be falling on the airlines than has historically been the case.
Something for investors in airlines to think about, I imagine. You both mentioned CORSIA in your earlier remarks. I mean, how viable is CORSIA as a global compliance mechanism to cover all of this?
I think, you look at CORSIA and that's being instituted by, and we're going to throw a lot of, a lot of acronyms here, but instituted by ICAO. ICAO is the Global International Civil Aviation Association. If you think about what the Paris Agreement is doing for national domestic emissions and what the IMO was planning to do on the maritime side, well, the ICAO is doing that for the aviation side. And their CORSIA approach is essentially a global approach where countries agree to it in the same way that countries agree to participate as part of the Paris Agreement. And we are going through and finishing up the phase 1, which is voluntary, and that will run until the end of 2026. And then we start phase 2, which is mandatory. But the voluntary phase has actually gotten 129 different states participating. So it actually the program is effectively kicked off. There are a number of questions with the program. I think some of them are the new member states whether they're actually going to be participating in 2027, and some of these key countries include Russia, China, India, and Brazil, which are not currently under the voluntary side. But even on those countries that are currently in the voluntary program, the question is that a robust program in that very few of those countries actually have a penalty system for not complying? And what makes it even more challenging is that it is very difficult to procure the carbon credits internationally, with the requirements around them. There's not enough supply for entities to actually meet their needs. So, and just briefly speaking, what CORSIA has put forth is a program that limits emissions reductions, but not necessarily through reductions within the sector. It's the ability to purchase CORSIA eligible credits globally and purchase those and use them to account for your compliance needs. So for that to work, obviously you can reduce your emissions directly. You can do that with SAF. You can do that with greater efficiency, with route changes. But if you want to use these credits, they have to be credits from approved sources, and they have to come with necessary other provisions, which are currently proving very challenging. So a supply issue, a demand issue, a compliance issue, and there's a question of whether Europe will deem this program sufficient enough to reduce reductions, because if not, they may take additional steps.
And I'm guessing that, in a world of tariffs, deglobalization, in a world where the international rules-based system is increasingly being challenged, things like CORSIA, big regulatory mechanisms and frameworks that go across borders, it's tougher, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, we just saw what happened with the IMO and their net zero framework, which this spring, there was an expectation that it would be finalized a few weeks ago. And what happened is that there was pushback actually led by the United States against a sort of global structure to address emissions. Now, right now, the US's position on ICAO is not clear, but it'll be one certainty to watch to see how that plays out, particularly, as I said, given what happened with the IMO.
Is there a technology magic bullet to all of this? I mean, we've talked a lot about fuel, we've talked about SAF, we've talked about different regulatory frameworks, CORSIA, ETS. But is there a technology element to this that we're perhaps missing? Hydrogen has been discussed as being a potential wonder fuel for aviation and lots of other forms of transport. Even electric. Occasionally, you see headlines saying that in the future we'll be able to fly in electric aeroplanes around the world. How realistic are some of these frontier technologies?
I can take a stab and maybe follow afterwards. I mean, this is why we do scenarios, and as I mentioned earlier, we have a base case scenario. We have other scenarios which we call adaptation, fracture, and renaissance. Out of all of these, actually, in all of these, we don't see hydrogen or electricity play a key role. With renaissance, they starts playing a key role maybe in 2040. In the others, it's much further out. So honestly, we see these as having potential, but in terms of even our most aggressive scenarios, we don't see real uptake with hydrogen and to a lesser extent electricity until well after 2045. So I think we have some time. We have some time. We have some time to see if there are technology developments that that we aren't foreseeing. But this is one of the realities why CORSIA is the approach that's being taken, because other than SAF, a lot of these other technologies are just not. They're certainly not commercialized, and they are a way off from being even proven commercially and technologically. And of course, open to things can change, but even in our most aggressive scenario, this doesn't happen until after 2040.
Do more sophisticated, efficient airplanes, do they have a part to play in this? I mean, even in all our lifetimes, aviation has got a lot more efficient. The planes can run further, less fuel, carry more people, faster. Is that perhaps the solution? So conventional engines, but just the plane is lighter, it's quicker, it's just more efficient.
I mean, we build those into our base case. I mean, so our base case is not a freezing of technology; it is an improvement of technology. So we certainly see more pressures now. The incentives for efficiency are there even without decarbonization pressures. The interesting thing is, like, given some of the geopolitical developments, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, et cetera, there are now many routes that have been rerouted, and to be honest, these sort of geopolitical fractures can lead to less efficient routes as well as more efficient routes. So particularly in our sort of fracture cases where there is much more balkanization, shall we say, then the opportunities for such efficiencies and synergies are decreased.
So, long-term outlook, projected tenfold increase in SAF demand by 2030, need for 80 million metric tons by 2050. That sounds like an awful lot. I'm not sure whether it is or not, but it sounds like an awful lot. What are the biggest unknowns and wildcards that could accelerate or, worst case scenario, decelerate this journey?
I mean, in terms of acceleration, I guess we would have to be to be very optimistic to hope for more SAF. But I would say definitely policy. If there's more alignment on policy at global level, for now we are, even in this outlook, we have different SAF penetration rates in different regions of the world. So we are assuming that Europe will continue to be the most ambitious in this space and have lower SAF blending rates in the US and in Asia. But if policy if we manage to have an international agreement on decarbonizing aviation and on SAF adoption, perhaps we'll see more support for SAF in the US and in Asia, and that would give a boost to SAF demand. I would say technological development, right? If we find more efficient ways, more less expensive ways of producing SAF, why not? And I would add feedstock availability. So again, developments on in terms of feedstocks, and I'm thinking here of energy crops. So we're doing analysis on the potential to scale up energy crops, and we think that this is doable. There's a lot of potential in Latin America in particular. So I'm talking here about things like carinata, camelina. On the what could lead us to less SAF uptake in the long term, I would say the same factors, right? Perhaps if we don't manage to see some alignment on policy at global level, perhaps Europe will scale back some of those mandates. Again, even in this outlook, we are assuming that a certain amount of energy crops will be produced, right? If energy crops don't actually take off, then this puts even more pressure on SAF supply.
I'm guessing that the price of conventional fossil fuels and conventional kerosene, jet kerosene, also has an impact on that. I mean, when you're looking at dated Brent at the moment, low to mid 60s, we're okay. We're at historic averages, but we're way below a lot of fiscal break evens for the producers. So it does incentivize demand and make it harder from a financial point of view for frontier fuels, SAF, energy transition linked fuels, to be more cost competitive than, say, if you had crude trading at $100 a barrel plus.
And Andy, I would add to that, it's not just the crude side; it's really the product side. Because if you think longer term, you think about in a world where the demand for refined products is looking to drop off. The question is, Jet Kero is in a tough position here because the overall demand for the refined products is going to be dropping off, even as its own demand is going to be increasing. So the question is, will refinery rationalizations actually be hitting the the supply of jet kerosene at the same time as it's responding to the fact that particularly the auto sector is being decarbonized through electric vehicles. So part of this is going to be the response of refineries and the extent to which they can earn enough on their jet kero runs to make up for the fact that the overall demand in gasoline is going to be dropping off.
Right, and when in some developed markets like the UK, for example, when you haven't had a refinery built for a long time, I think that it's going to be difficult to potentially meet that demand unless you're going to rely on imports. Just to finish off, the report Decarbonizing Aviation. Where can listeners, our audience for this podcast, where can they get that report? They can contact you directly.
Yes, no, they can absolutely contact us directly. To be sure, this is what this report is part of is a set of reports that we put out both on a quarterly basis and an ad hoc basis that are called our looked forward reports, and these reflect really the combination of efforts across our divisions. So I'd mentioned our own efforts as Commodity Insights, but with assistance from ratings, from our ratings team as well. And yeah, if you go to our Look Forward journal and our Look Forward publications on the S&P Global website, you'll see this alongside with a lot of other topics. And I can note that there's going to be additional interesting topics coming up in the next publication, which should be coming out in December.
So if you have not bookmarked on your desktop or mobile device, Look Forward at the spglobal.com website, then you need to do that ASAP for more fantastic research, deep insights, and forward thinking from experts like Roman Kramarchuk. Thank you so much, Director Head of Energy Transition Narratives and Policy at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and Clarita Associate Director, Biofuels Analytics at S&P Global Commodity Insights. Thank you both for being such great guests on the Look Forward podcast. You can download this episode and future episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or go and check us out on YouTube. Thank you very much.